The homeless man sat quietly against the brick wall, his German shepherd resting at his side. In the small town of Ridgewood, he was a familiar yet invisible presence, ignored by most, pitied by a few. But to the Iron Fangs, a gang of rowdy bikers, he was nothing more than easy prey, someone to mock, to taunt, to push for their own amusement. What they didn't know was that the man they saw as weak had once been something else entirely. And tonight, their mistake would cost them. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching this from. Leave a comment below and see who's tuning in from the farthest place. The town of Ridgewood wasn't a place where many things change. It was small, quiet, and predictable, the kind of town where everyone had their routines. The main street had a few stores, a couple of diners, a gas station, and the Rusty Chain, a bar where the local bikers gathered every evening. And then there was him. No one knew exactly when the homeless man had appeared, but he had become a fixture outside the old convenience store near the gas station. Every day, rain or shine, he sat on the same spot, his back resting against the red brick wall, his gaze fixed on the distant highway. He rarely spoke, rarely moved. He wasn't like other homeless people. He never begged, never asked for help. His only companion was a German shepherd, a strikingly well-groomed and disciplined dog that sat beside him like a silent guardian. Some in town pitied him, some ignored him, but the Iron Fangs, a group of rough, rowdy bikers who frequented the Rusty Chain, found him entertaining. To them, he was just another piece of street trash, a man who had failed at life. And if life had already beaten him down, what harm was there in kicking him a little more? It started with small jabs. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a burnt orange, a group of bikers emerged from the Rusty Chain. Their heavy boots clunked against the pavement, their voices loud, full of crude jokes and drunken laughter. Vince, the youngest and cockiest among them, was the first to sneer at the homeless man. "Hey, old man," he called, tossing a cigarette butt in his direction. "You lose your house in a poker game? Or are you just too stupid to keep a job?" His friends chuckled, amused. The homeless man didn't flinch. He sat there, unmoving, his hands resting loosely on his lap. His dog remained just as still, its ears flicking slightly at the sound of Vince's voice but making no other movement. His silence only encouraged them. Another biker, Danny, grinned and pulled some coins from his pocket. "Here, buddy," he said mockingly, flicking a few pennies onto the sidewalk. The coins bounced and rolled, one of them hitting the tip of the homeless man's worn-out boot. Still, no reaction, no anger, no shame, just quiet indifference. It was as if they didn't exist. That irritated Vince. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. He took a slow bite of the burger in his hand, chewing loudly. "Bet that mutt eats better than you." "Huh?" He exaggerated each chew, making a show of savoring the food before swallowing it. The homeless man's expression didn't change. The German shepherd, however, lifted its head slightly, its deep brown eyes locked onto Vince with quiet intelligence, as if studying him, measuring him. That only made Vince's grin widen. "Oh, look at that," he said. "The dog's got more life in it than its owner." The group erupted into laughter. And still, nothing. The homeless man sat, unmoved, his gaze steady, his breathing calm. There was something unnerving about how unaffected he seemed, how no insult or mockery even touched him. For most people, that kind of treatment would have sparked some sort of reaction, anger, embarrassment, maybe even fear. But this man was different, and they were too arrogant to notice. As the days went by, the bikers continued their routine. Every time they passed the homeless man, they made their jokes, tossed their insults, threw their pennies. It was an easy amusement for them, something to pass the time before another night of drinking and riding. And then, one night, they decided to push it further. It was past midnight when they stumbled out of the Rusty Chain, the effects of too many beers making their laughter louder, their steps heavier. The street was empty except for the flickering neon lights of the gas station and the soft hum of a street lamp overhead. And, of course, him, as always. The homeless man was there, seated against the same wall, his dog curled beside him like a silent sentinel. The dog's ears perked up slightly as the bikers approached. but it didn't move. Vince, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of his friends, decided he had had enough of the man's quiet indifference. He wanted a reaction. "Let's see if the mutt's as smart as he looks," he muttered, reaching into the greasy paper bag in his hand. He pulled out a leftover chicken wing. He waved it in front of the dog's face, the smell of seasoned meat filling the air. Then, with a sharp whistle, he tossed it a few feet away. Any hungry stray would have jumped at the food without hesitation. But the German Shepherd didn't move. It didn't even glance at the discarded food. Instead, it stayed perfectly still, its body tense, its gaze locked onto Vince's face. That wasn't the reaction he had expected. Vince frowned. "Huh, what's the matter, old man? Your dog too good for my food?" The homeless man finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, cold, too clear for a man who was supposed to be broken. "Leave us be," he said simply. His voice was steady, deep, carrying a quiet authority that sent an unexpected chill through the group. But Vince wasn't backing down. His pride had been wounded. He wasn't about to be dismissed like that, especially not by some nobody sitting on the pavement. So he did something stupid. He reached down and grabbed the dog's collar. The reaction was instant. Before Vince could tighten his grip, the German Shepherd moved in a blur of muscle and precision. With a single, controlled motion, it twisted out of his grasp and knocked him backward, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. It hadn't bitten him. It hadn't attacked. It had simply defended, as if it had been trained to handle threats with precision and control. Vince hit the ground hard, the impact rattling his teeth. The laughter of his friends quickly turned into stunned silence. "What the hell?" he spat, scrambling to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment. He clenched his fists, ready to strike, but then he stopped, because the homeless man was standing now, too, and for the first time, they really saw him. He wasn't just some frail, defeated drifter. His movements were controlled, his stance balanced, his shoulders were broad, his posture straight, too straight for someone who had supposedly spent years living on the streets. His eyes weren't just calm. They were assessing, calculating, dangerous. The air around them shifted, the drunken bravado draining from the group. Something was wrong. Something about him wasn't right. Vince swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to step back. But it was already too late. Because they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had picked a fight with a man they didn't understand. And they had no idea who he really was. Vince's hands clenched into fists, his breath heavy with fury. His body still ached from being slammed to the pavement. But the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning inside him. The street, once filled with drunken laughter and taunts, had gone eerily silent. The other bikers stood motionless, their grins long gone, their confidence cracked. The homeless man was still standing, still calm, still looking at them with that same infuriating lack of concern. Like they were nothing, like they weren't even worth his time. Vince wiped the sweat from his brow and spat onto the pavement. His face was red, his jaw clenched so tightly it felt like his teeth might crack. "I'm not letting this slide," he snarled, stepping forward. His boots scuffed against the pavement, and his gang instinctively moved behind him, closing in, ready to correct the disrespect they had just been dealt. Danny hesitated. His instincts screamed at him that this wasn't a fight they could win. He could see it now. Really see it. The way the old man moved wasn't just fast. It was efficient, practiced. Vince thought he had been caught off guard. Danny knew better. That wasn't luck. That wasn't some lucky shot from a desperate old man trying to defend himself. That was control. But Vince didn't see it. Or worse, he refused to see it. "You think you can just sit there and look down on us? Huh?" Vince spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You got one lucky shot. You think that makes you tough?" The homeless man said nothing. And that was worse than any insult. Vince's fingers twitched. He needed a reaction. Anything. "You're just a washed-up loser," Vince sneered, stepping even closer. His gang followed, their bodies tense, fists clenching. The scent of beer and sweat hung heavy in the night air. "You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." The homeless man slowly exhaled through his nose. Then, finally, he moved, not in fear, not in anger, just deliberately, with complete, unshakable control. He stood a little straighter, shifting his weight ever so slightly, so subtly that none of them noticed just how perfectly balanced he was. His dog remained still, ears twitching, watching. Danny felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. Then the homeless man spoke, his voice low and even. "Go home." Vince let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You don't get to tell us what to do, old man." He lunged. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 bikers followed, fists raised, ready to swing. The homeless man moved, not with brute force, not with anger, with speed, with precision. Before Vince's punch even reached him, the man had already sidestepped. His movements fluid, almost lazy, with a sharp, controlled motion. He grabbed Vince's wrist and twisted just enough. Vince's body buckled before he even knew what was happening. A sharp yank, a shift in balance, and Vince was flying through the air before his back slammed into the pavement with a loud, sickening thud. His lungs emptied, his head spun, but there was no time to process. The first biker swung. The homeless man ducked so smoothly it looked effortless and delivered a sharp, bone-crushing strike to the biker's ribs. The air left the man's lungs in a strangled gasp, his body folding in on itself. The second man tried to tackle him. Bad mistake. The homeless man turned with the momentum, guiding the biker's own weight against him before sweeping his legs out from under him. The biker hit the ground hard, his head smacking against the pavement. It was over. The entire fight had lasted less than 10 seconds. Vince lay gasping, his chest heaving. The other 2 groaned on the ground beside him. The rest of the bikers stood frozen. Their drunken courage evaporated. Danny's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a normal guy. The homeless man took a single step forward, his boots scraping softly against the pavement. His calm, focused eyes scanned the group, not like a man who had just won a fight, but like a man who had just decided to end it. His hands were still relaxed. He hadn't even needed to try. Vince struggled to push himself up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Every muscle ached, his breath still shallow. His ego screamed at him to fight back, to do something, but he knew, they all knew, there was nothing they could do. Vince's fingers curled into fists. His pride was in tatters, but there was no salvaging it now. He needed something, anything, to feel like he still had control, even if it was just words. "You got lucky," he hissed, his voice barely more than a breath. "Next time, you won't." It was pathetic. Everyone knew it, even he knew it. The homeless man just watched. No reaction, no smirk, no words. He just turned away, and that hurt worse than the beating. Vince's stomach twisted as he staggered to his feet, refusing to look at his own gang. He could feel their eyes on him, feel the weight of his failure pressing down. His teeth ground together as he stomped to his bike, wrenching the handlebars like he could squeeze his dignity back into his hands. The others followed, moving too quickly, desperate to escape whatever this night had become. Engines roared to life. Vince twisted the throttle harder than he needed to, sending his tires screeching against the pavement. He needed to go, now. He glanced one last time toward the homeless man and his dog. They weren't looking. They had already moved on. Like the fight had never even happened. Like he had never even mattered. A pit formed in Vince's stomach. He cursed under his breath and revved his bike forward, tearing off into the darkness. The others followed, their headlights disappearing one by one. The street was silent once more. The homeless man let out a slow breath, finally relaxing. The German shepherd nudged his leg, and he reached down, rubbing behind its ear. "Good boy." The dog let out a soft huff, leaning into his touch. For a while, he just sat there, listening to the quiet hum of the night. He had seen men like those bikers before. He had fought far worse men before. And if there was one thing he knew for certain, it was this: they wouldn't be back. The night had settled into silence, the echoes of revving engines long gone. The homeless man sat back down against the brick wall, his German shepherd curling up beside him, resting its head on his knee. He ran a slow hand through the dog's fur, staring at the empty street ahead. The fight was over, but his mind had already drifted elsewhere, somewhere much farther than this small town, beyond this quiet life he had carved for himself. Frank Reyes, the owner of the convenience store, stepped cautiously out of his shop. He had watched everything from the window. He had seen the bikers, their taunts, the fight, and how quickly it had all ended. More importantly, he had seen how controlled the homeless man had been. How he had moved like someone who had done this before. Many times. Frank wasn't a fool. He had served in the military himself. Though not in combat, he recognized the way the man fought. The discipline in his stance. The precision of his strikes. The way he handled the dog with such care told him even more. This man wasn't just some former soldier. He was something much more. Frank hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Clearing his throat. "You okay?" he asked. The homeless man nodded, still scratching the dog's ear. "Yeah." Frank sighed and leaned against the wall next to him, crossing his arms. "I've seen plenty of fights in my time. But that wasn't just a fight. That was a lesson." He glanced down at the German Shepherd. "And that dog, that's no stray." The man remained silent for a moment. Then finally, he spoke. "His name is Max," he said. "He's been with me for a long time." Frank studied the dog again, noticing how its ears twitched at every slight noise. How it remained completely still but ready. This was a military working dog. No doubt about it. A war dog. Frank exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't suppose you'll tell me who you really are?" The man let out a small, tired chuckle. "Does it matter?" Frank shrugged. "Maybe not, but I think you deserve more than sitting on this corner, drinking gas station coffee and getting harassed by punks with too much ego and not enough sense." The man was silent again. He seemed to be debating whether to speak. But eventually, he did. "My name is James Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if he was remembering how to say it. "I served for 22 years. Special Forces. K-9 unit. Max was my partner." Frank's breath hitched slightly. Special Forces. That explained everything. The precision. The discipline. The fact that he had taken down 3 men in seconds. James ran a hand down Max's back. "We were deployed together for 6 years. Afghanistan. Syria. Places I don't even like to think about." His eyes darkened slightly, his voice growing distant. "We did things that needed to be done. Stopped men who needed to be stopped." Frank remained quiet, letting him talk. James exhaled slowly. "We got out 6 years ago." "Well, I got out." He looked down at Max. He was supposed to be retired, given to some officer's family to live out his days in a backyard somewhere. Frank tilted his head. "But that's not what happened." James shook his head. "He wouldn't leave me, no matter what they tried. He wouldn't take commands from anyone else." His fingers gently traced the fur on Max's head. "They told me he wasn't fit for a normal life. They were going to put him down." Frank's stomach turned. "So you took him?" James nodded. "Walked out with him one day and never looked back." Frank let out a low whistle. "And what happened to you?" James leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. "Ever hear the phrase, 'A soldier without a war is a man without a home'?" Frank nodded. He knew plenty of men like that. Men who had returned from war but never really come back. James sighed. "I tried to adjust. I did. Moved around. Took jobs where I could. Construction. Security. But none of it stuck. I spent my whole life being trained for one thing. And when that was over, I didn't know what to do with myself." He looked around at the quiet street. "So I drifted. Ended up here." Frank studied him for a moment. "And you're okay with that?" James gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't have much, but I have Max. That's more than enough." Silence hung between them for a moment before Frank sighed. "Well, I don't know about you, but I think you've had enough of sitting on this damn corner." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Frank nodded. "I got a back room in the shop. It ain't much, but it's warm, and it's got a real bed. You can stay there, help out if you want. No pressure." James looked at him carefully. "Why?" Frank shrugged. "Because I've seen too many good men left out in the cold. And I don't think you belong out here." James glanced down at Max, who nudged his hand gently, as if urging him. He let out a small breath, then nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll think about it." Frank smiled. "You do that, but take your time. I'm not going anywhere." As Frank turned back toward the shop, James remained seated, watching as Max lifted his head to look at him. The dog's eyes were steady, waiting for him to make the next move. For the first time in a long time, James felt like maybe, just maybe, He had somewhere to go. He scratched Max behind the ear, then stood up. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "Let's see what a real bed feels like." Max wagged his tail as they followed Frank inside, disappearing into the warm glow of the shop. The street remained quiet, empty, as if nothing had happened at all. But for James Carter, a man without a war and a dog without a home, something had finally changed, and for the first time in years, it felt like the fight was finally over. What do you think about today's story? Do you believe situations like this can happen in real life? If you have any thoughts or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any exciting stories. See you in the next video.